everyone. So, to be or not to be national parks, maybe I should rather rephrase that and say to beekeep or not to beekeep in national parks. Should that be a question that we ask in protected area management? With sincere intentions, beehives exist in some of our parks, and many attempts have been made via various avenues to introduce beehives and associated beekeeping activities into national parks through, for example, community beekeeping projects, through research and various other initiatives. And also in addition to dealing with problematic bees. And our responses and actions thus far have mostly been reactive and uncoordinated, with the parks doing the best that they can within the situation that they find themselves in. And with the increase in international concern around pollinator decline, SANParks needed to develop or to have a standpoint with regards to beekeeping in protected areas, as well as develop guidelines to deal with honeybee-related challenges and applications, and also provide some consistency throughout the organization. And this was done through the development of standard operating procedure document. So to start with the fundamentals, or with the basics, pollination is an ecosystem service, as many of you will know, that's important for plant reproduction, and it assists in turning flowers into fruit and veg. And when you think of pollinators, you probably think of the honeybee. That's what we all think of, myself included. But that's because of humans' long history with honeybees and with managing them. And honeybees are the most well-known insects that exist and that are used by humans for pollination and for honey production. But pollination is a service provided by a variety of animals, and that are responsible for pollinating more than 80% of our flowering plants, and are important in most, if not all, terrestrial ecosystems. And most pollinator species are wild, and they include various invertebrate and vertebrate species. And then there's the infamous honeybee that's portrayed often as the pollination hero, but honeybees are in fact not the only bees. And we generally use the term bees and honeybees interchangeably because for decades honeybees have received the most attention as a result of their use in agriculture. And many people are not aware that there are actually a variety of bees, and majority of them, almost more than 90% of them, are solitary. So that basically means they live alone, they don't live in social groups like honeybees do, and they don't make honey and wax and products that we would generally want to use. So bees are actually quite a diverse group of insects with estimates of over 20,000 known species. There's a lot more still to be discovered, I'm sure, and that's worldwide. And South Africa is known as a global center for bee diversity, and our bee fauna are highly endemic, so that makes it super important to protect them. But over the years, pollination has mostly been simplistically accredited to the honeybee. They've been domesticated as they are easy to manage and also manipulate, and they can be moved around for crop pollination and for honey production. Honeybees are generalists, so that means that they can pollinate most plants, and people think, but what is the problem with that? But solitary bees, on the other hand, are better suited to specific plants, so they are therefore better and more effective pollinators. So to go back to the honeybee, Apis mellifera is the most common honeybee. South Africa has two subspecies, the Cape honeybee, that's endemic to the Cape Floristic region, and the African honeybee that occurs through the rest of South Africa. So they've got these quite defined zones of where they occur. So as I've mentioned, insect pollinator declines, it's been a topic of concern globally, and research shows that the declines are largely attributed to human activities like pesticide use, disease, land use intensification, habitat loss and degradation, especially through monoculture agriculture. So what happens if we lose our wild pollinators? The loss of diversity of pollinators, of wild pollinators, can cause many knock-on effects on our ecosystems. Vital pollination services will be lost. This is a negative ecological and economic impacts on wild plant diversity, on ecosystem stability, on crop pollination, on food security, and ultimately on our well-being. So these declines have resulted in increased actions and initiatives to conserve pollinator populations, but particularly calls to save honeybees. And even though honeybees are at risk of pests and disease, global honeybee stocks have actually increased, and artificially so. But this is not to compensate for pollinator declines or because that honeybees are in trouble. It's more as a result of the increase in demand on agriculture to production needed to sustain our increasing human population. Therefore, pollinator declines and the perceived honeybee decline should not be confused. But honeybees are not in trouble. Honeybee farming and agricultural activities to artificially increase populations, it benefits agriculture and it's not required for bee and other conservation, as is often claimed. It actually has negative unintended consequences on pollination and ecosystem dynamics, which I will elaborate on in just a bit. So I mentioned that we are developing an SOP, but before I get to that, let me just get some clarity or give you some clarity on the terminology that confuses people. So when we talk about beehives, that refers to the artificial structures that are used in agriculture and in beekeeping. They are housed in various boxes like this, concrete wooden boxes. But wild honeybee colonies, or the species that exist as non-managed populations, they house themselves in what we call nests, and they are naturally occurring. So these can be found in various substrates like rock cavities, in tree trunks, and so on. But the challenges arise when honeybees nest in or on human infrastructure, which is one of the reasons why we are developing the SOP. And with human infrastructure, we've artificially and indirectly provided them with nesting sites, which in a natural ecosystem, in some natural ecosystems, it may have been a constraining factor limiting the occurrences in those areas. So we've removed that constraining factor and honeybee populations are in turn artificially increasing. But in addition to that, bee farming and agriculture outside of protected areas also contribute to artificially increasing honeybee populations. So there's a lot of things at play in protected areas. So to get back to our SOP, it's still in the draft phase. We've been busy with it for quite some time, but the purpose of it basically is to ensure the protection of wild honeybees, the wild colonies, and also the wild pollinator populations within our protected areas. In other words, to provide a refuge for them, and also to allow for additional benefits to the surrounding land users where pollinator diversity may be limited or affected. So what gave rise to this SOP, the Standard Operating Procedures document? Many of the parks are experiencing challenges with honeybees nesting in park infrastructure. Beekeepers also, they seek insecticide-free, convenient and resource-rich habitats, which protected areas are, and they've become attractive to beekeepers. And there seems to be an increase in requests via various avenues through various departments to have hives placed in our protected areas. And our response to the various challenges that are experienced, the various applications that have come in have mostly been reactive and have been dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and it's for the most part been uncoordinated. So that's another reason why SANParks needed to have a standpoint with regards to beekeeping in national parks, but also provide guidelines on how to deal with the challenges that are experienced by the managers. And we do understand that in science, we usually tend to think long-term, whereas managers, they need to act in the moment and they've got a short time. So we need to find a compromise between all the different objectives or the different needs that are needed within the different departments. So other conservation agencies, they face similar challenges and they've put similar plans in place, especially to safeguard wild pollinators. Just to quickly touch on the objectives. As I mentioned, we want to safeguard the wild pollinator populations, particularly of the two subspecies that we've got in South Africa, but also to protect the other wild pollinator populations, and also to protect functional habitats or keep the habitats functional and also the ecosystems. We can't protect honeybees in isolation. In other words, we can't focus on one species. We need to look at or consider ecosystem level impacts when we when we do anything within our national parks. So what we are suggesting, or what we've put on the table as Conservation Services Department, is to just continue the artificial introduction of beehives within national parks. We want to remove all the existing beehives within national parks. We want to prevent the removal of our wild colonies and associated products. This will be a difficult one. Some of our parks have agricultural activities right on their boundaries and within their buffer zones. So we want to start or guide engagement with our neighboring landowners to let them know about the negative impacts within our protected areas and how we can work together to more sustainably work together in the future. And also, as I mentioned, to provide guidelines to regulate the intervention that we need to do. So there are a wide range of implications for wild pollinators if we introduce managed hives or bees in national parks. Managed bees, they outcompete wild pollinators for floral resources. And one study that I read, the results said that over 3 months, a 40-hive apiary collected the pollen equivalent of 4 million solitary bees, and that for me was quite an eye-opener. They also negatively impact pollination networks. So pollinator populations are self-organized and they are in a natural state of flux. So unnaturally increasing the population of a single species, particularly of generalists like honeybees, will have negative knock-on effects on other species, on other plants and other animals. Managed bees have been linked to also sources and spreaders of pathogens and disease that affects other insect pollinators, and the introduction of artificial hives could also be a source of disease. And because honeybees are generalist species, as I mentioned, they have indirect impacts on plant community composition. So many plants, as many of you will know, have specific pollinators. So they need those relationships with the pollinators. So we can't lose that. So we are currently at, this actually started out as a scientific services position statement. Because of all the applications that we've been receiving, we wanted to kind of standardize our input or our advice going forward. But then through head office, they advised that we rather turn it into an SOP, a standard operating procedure document, to better structure the organization standpoint going forward. So, as I mentioned, the different departments have conflicting objectives. So we have consulted with the various departments within the organization. We've also consulted with bee specialists, and various versions have been drafted. But there has been a little bit of contention between the departments in taking this SOP forward, in that we've got a commitment to socioeconomic beneficiation, to which beekeeping has been perceived as a mechanism to achieve this outcome. So to end off, I'd like to highlight a few points. I do know that it's quite complex within the organization, and as I mentioned, each department has their objectives and has their things that they need to achieve. So it is about finding that balance, which is in itself difficult, but I must highlight that beekeeping is an agricultural activity and should not be confused with conservation. Beekeeping is often promoted as a way to conserve pollinators. I like this comparison, which is the equivalent of farming chickens to save wild birds. So where there are information gaps, the precautionary principle should apply. Thank you.